Welcome back, everybody, to the the second session. And what we're going to do is we've got two talks, which will take us up to another break for tea, coffee, at which I would encourage you all, as well as taking the refreshments, to also look at the posters which are here on display, which are excellent and form an important part of this showcase. Following on from the themes that started off with in the lightning talks and further developed in Martin McKee's talk, the two speakers this afternoon will be picking up on some of those, particularly, I think it would be fair to say, on complexity and systems, as well as power of corporations and also governments. And while Martin talked about power as a concept that had been dropped by economists, I tend, as a psychologist, to think about power as something that sociologists in particular have written a lot about. As I say that, I remember that I didn't introduce myself. I'm a psychologist, Teresa Marteau, and I'm based here in Cambridge at the Institute of Public Health, where I direct the Behaviour and Health Research Unit. Enough of me. I now want to turn to our first speaker, Larry King, and hopefully you have all got, whether stapled or unstapled, these excellent booklets which will give you the biographical details of our speakers as well as a sketch of what they're going to talk about. So Larry is a professor here at the University of Cambridge of sociology and political economy. So Larry is going to talk to us about the causes of the causes in terms of privatization and the post-communist mortality crisis, alcohol stress and beyond. So Larry, without further ado.
Thank you very much. It's great to be having this event. I'm going to talk about some research which I think is an example of what I call the political economy of public health. And in this case, it's not actually about corporate power. It's about actually microeconomic policy and the health consequences. It's not unrelated to corporate power in terms of that's another story about how these policies were generated. This is about, as we'll see, about the effect of privatization on the post-communist mortality crisis. Many people in this room, actually, I'm going to talk about several stages of research on this topic, but the initial work was done with David Stuckler, who's right here, which we did initially at Yale, and then we followed that up with an article with me, David, and Martin in The Lancet a couple years after that, and then many iterations of it. So this is about the post-communist mortality crisis. You may or may not be aware of the post-communist mortality crisis, that where after the transition to capitalism, something like 7 million excess deaths occurred in the first decade. I like to call it economic genocide, and it's amazing how little work and discussion there has been on it. And it's startling in and of itself, but what's also quite interesting is the research that's been done on it. So traditional public health research, public health is primarily, sociologists kind of studied various aspects of the transition and poverty. They didn't study the mortality crisis. Political scientists kind of studied the political system. Economists, well, they didn't do much of anything. I mean, well, they did, but not in terms of studying it. Public health was really the discipline that studied it, but primarily for 15 years, most of the research was devoted to showing the proximal causes of what explained this mortality. And the conclusions were that alcohol and stress were related to the mortality crisis, probably. So really, we kind of knew that. But lots of stuff was unexplained. There was massive variation. You could look at Russia and Kazakhstan compared to Poland. Within Russia, the richer regions had a worse mortality crisis. It wasn't the poor, it wasn't the young and the old who you would expect to die in economic catastrophes, but primarily working age men. All sorts of unexplained variation and essentially no explanation. Almost no research on the explanation. So being a political economist, I had been studying privatization and the transition to capitalism. And my suspicion was that, there we go, that what caused the variation had something to do with the policies for the transition from a capitalist, from a communist to a capitalist system. And what virtually all the post-communist countries, the advice that they got from mainstream economists, many of whom knew nothing about the countries and admittedly knew nothing about the countries. Jeff Sachs described it as trying to operate on a patient and cutting open the patient and the organs are all in different places. So, I mean, what would you do? I might call in a doctor who actually knows where the organs are supposed to be, but he operated anyway. So the policy advice was liberalize the economy, meaning open up markets internally and liberalize trade to create a monetary system of low inflation and stable money, so you had true prices, and then you needed the correct incentive structure. So now you have markets providing information, stable money to make that information, reliable, and then if you had private property, you would have the incentive structure, and you would get a reallocation of resources. So those were the so-called shock therapy, also called the Washington Consensus. Liberalize, stabilize, we know a euphemism for austerity, and privatize. Now, policy, the policy for stabilization was kind of, they knew how to they didn't stabilize the economy. There was hyperinflation, but they thought they knew how to stabilize the economy, which was basically raise interest rates and limit monetary emissions. You raise interest rates because then banks loan out less money and there's less money in circulation. Well, you could ask about why they got hyperinflation. But liberalization, they knew how to liberalize, and they had lots of experience liberalizing and stabilizing economies in Latin America and Africa. Privatization was another thing entirely. I mean, Margaret Thatcher privatized, depending on how you count, 31 companies in 11 years in the country where capitalism started and the most institutions to protect shareholder rights. The advice that was given to Russia was to privatize 200,000 enterprises in a country with no established business class, no established system of taxation, of business taxation, no established system of property rights. And they were to do it, moreover, in a couple of years. And the argument for such rapid privatization was, first of all, that private ownership is always superior to public ownership. Everyone knows it. You don't even have to explain why that's true. But also there was an underlying political logic. And the political logic was we have to smash the communist power base, which is in state-owned enterprises, but also this is also a transition to democracy. And workers and managers at enterprises might figure out that they're going to be losers if they lose guaranteed employment. So privatize while you have a window of opportunity to privatize. If you don't, you'll get caught somewhere half between capitalism and communism, market socialism, which everyone knows can't produce economic development, like in China. Anyway, so there's an exceptional period. We have to privatize as quickly as possible. So, although not much was talked about it, what was launched was one of the greatest experiments in economic engineering since Stalin did his forced industrialization. And a program that was called mass privatization. And this was, well, we know we don't have the capitalists to privatize all these companies. We don't have time to let private markets develop to then kind of competitively bid for companies. There's not enough foreign investment, and anyway, foreign investors wouldn't want to buy all these old dinosaur companies that everyone knows are obsolete. So what we'll do is essentially give vouchers or coupons to citizens that could then be redeemed for shares in companies, and poof, you have private owners. So that was the theory that was implemented in many of the countries. In Russia, about 80% of the industrial structure was privatized through this method. And it varied. So when I looked at all of the different transition countries, about 30 countries, and I looked at the policies that were implemented, most of them did a version of liberalization and stabilization, and the greatest amount of variation was on privatization. And I deeply suspected that privatization was one of the determinants of mortality crisis. Please don't misinterpret me to think that this is the only cause of the mortality crisis in Russia. I'm not claiming that. David and I were never claiming that. The collapse of the Soviet Empire, liberalization, austerity, there were lots of causes, but this is one of the policy causes that I thought we can demonstrate. So what exactly were the linkages? What is the link between mass privatization? Well, the first one is firms were there was guaranteed employment, and you didn't have to pay your wage bill. So firms in Soviet times employed as many people as possible. Essentially, workers had rights to guarantee jobs forever. So there was massive overemployment. So the first thing you would do when you would privatize would be to get rid of kind of the useless workers. So that would create unemployment, that would create mortality. That would create stress, could be linked to drinking, and through other mechanisms create mortality. Firms also provided a lot of medical care in the Soviet system, a huge amount of social benefits that were, during privatization, were then transferred to local governments, which were all in the process of going bankrupt. So this is another possible mechanism. Loss of also social consumption. They provided vacation homes, education facilities, sanatorium, all sorts of things that kind of disappeared with the privatization. Privatization, I've shown in other work, because creating owners who have no capital, no expertise, no ability to monitor firm insiders, no market connections is a recipe for economic catastrophe. So that also creates economic failure in the firms, leading to stress and mortality, economic decline. It's also created state failure. And why did it create state failure? Because the Soviet system, although everyone knew how dysfunctional many of the Soviet enterprises were, the profitable Soviet enterprises were still the main mechanism of funding the state. And privatization severed that before a taxation system was well established and working. So this also created a fiscal crisis for the state, and that led to state collapse and all sorts of deleterious outcomes. And then also, finally, an effect through inequality. Even though vouchers were given out to everybody, they were quickly concentrated by people with political connections, what we call oligarchs. And by the end of the decade, 50% of the economy was owned by 10 financial industrial business groups, which were centered around what we call an oligarch, or you could call clientelistic capitalism. So go from almost no inequality to enormous inequality. These are all hypothetical mechanisms. So what if we just look at the data before we do any regressions or anything like that, and we look at countries that did mass privatizations and those that didn't, and on average they had almost a year less of loss of life. They had about a year more loss of life expectancy. So just unadjusted data. If you break the countries up into those that performed mass privatization programs and those that didn't, we see this enormous dip, and this is the years during which most privatization programs occurred. So we see what at least is seemingly a large effect. When we compare Russia, the blue line, and Belarus, or white Russia, kind of little Russia, very similar culturally, similar cultures of drinking, but did very different policies. We could see that mortality is fairly close, and then Russia begins its privatization, and you get, this is where the mass privatization ends, it skyrockets, and then it starts to go down until you get the next economic, the dual crisis, the dual devaluation and default of 1998, when it skyrockets again. This is just a simple cross-sectional regression, just looking at economic growth. Just to look at some of these possible mechanisms, we see that mass privatized countries in very simple regression is associated with almost 50% less economic growth. This is something the World Bank calls the Quality of Governance Index, which is kind of supposedly a measure of how effective the state is. And in practice, it goes from 1 to 3, but it was like 0.8 to 1.6 were the actual scores. So mass privatizers had less effective states than everybody else. So now let's get to the actual analysis of the effects of mass privatization. So how did we measure mass privatization? Well, one is I read all of the documents produced by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and coded whether there was a mass privatization or not. And I said if more than 25% of large enterprises were privatized with a voucher program, I coded it as mass privatization. It was kind of a natural break in the data. But then what we also did was the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development also produced indexes of privatization, a small scale and large scale index. These went from 1 to 4. I thought these were quite problematic for many reasons, including that they kind of built success into their index. Their functional form was quite strange. It was 1 to 4 star. And for those of you old enough to remember the movie Spinal Tap with the amp that goes to 11, that's what I thought the 4 star meant. Well, David was doing these regressions, and when he actually looked at them, and the other thing was it wasn't clear what was a small enterprise. Sometimes it was small and medium, sometimes it was medium and large, and then the numbers were all different. And then David discovered they were correlated at, what, 0.9 or something. So what we did was we combined them as an alternative measure. So we just gave an average of them. So this is a very conservative regression. There's a dummy for each year, so any kind of global effects will be captured, and it's fixed effects. So basically, we're also controlling for time invariant factors in each country, the country's culture, the country's language, et cetera. So this is a very conservative estimation, and what we see is that with this estimation, mass privatization knocked about 1.6 years off of life expectancy. Military conflict, about half that effect. So mass privatization killed twice as many people as war. Economic growth is in the right direction, but what this tells you is that economic growth would have to increase about 100% as a result of mass privatization to offset the effect of the privatization program on mortality. And as we've already seen, mass privatization damaged growth. It didn't enhance growth. Amazing to me was that the average privatization index gave us essentially the same result because the average score was about 2.3, and we essentially got the same result using the EBRD's own measure of privatization. Now this is quite interesting, the cumulative privatization index. So one of the things that the IMF and the EBRD and the shock therapists would say, well, this might create short-term pain, but it'll create long-term gain. So the cumulative liberalization index is something where you sum up the EBRD indices. So early deep reformers will have a much higher score. So those that really went hard at shock therapy, that this should be a positive. If there's a short-term loss for long-term gain, this should be positive, but there's absolutely no effect. There's all short-term loss and no long-term gain. What about where was this mortality concentrated? So this is on log male death rates now, not life expectancy, and we see everything's kind of makes sense for growth, how it's kind of spread across the ages. We see that the mortality associated with mass privatization is very much concentrated in the working age population, and this is males. What about the mechanisms? We see that mass privatization is associated with increased alcohol consumption, alcohol death rates, male heart disease, suicide, homicide, and unemployment. So a lot of evidence, we think, from cross-national regressions corroborating the idea that mass privatization was implicated in the mortality crisis. We did a whole series of controls. Interestingly, we looked at a whole series of health systems measures, and mass privatization did have an effect on health systems, a deleterious effect on health systems, but that didn't have an effect on mortality. Because the types of mortality, the modal death in Russia was you basically drink a liter of vodka and drive your Lada off a cliff. It wasn't amenable to health system interventions. Only 10 to 20% was really amenable to health system intervention. So although it did damage health systems, that didn't really explain, in the 90s anyway, the health crisis, the mortality crisis. So then if you present this to an economist, they'll say, this is all a story of endogeneity. It's countries that were headed for disaster, that, the only policy they could do was mass privatization. So what looks like an association between privatization and mortality is actually caused by this other variable, let's call it, badness or bad leadership or bad culture or whatever. Jeff Sachs said there was a lousy Russian culture that he thought was responsible for everything in Russia. I asked him, I had lunch with him at Yale when I taught there. I said, would you do anything differently? He said, no, except I'd never set foot in Russia. Well, Jeff Sachs will enter back into the story. So from studying the privatization as a political economist, as a sociologist, I thought that it was politically determined, not economically determined, but politically determined. And if we look at a linear probability model, what predicted mass privatization was being part of the former Soviet Union. So you look around at the big, powerful countries, what they did, and you mimic them. And a variable on ethnic minority, and this is essentially the size of the Russian population in the countries that used to be part of the former Soviet Union. And these people had the jobs who were managers of state enterprises. And if you were a newly independent regime and you want to kick your managers out, one of the best way to do it is to change ownership and replace all of the management. So that was chopped up into thirds, and that for each third you were 23% more likely to pursue mass privatization. So then when you put this into various selection models, I won't get into this for those of you familiar with it, it only amplifies the effect all the way up to 5 years. So to the extent there was an endogeneity effect, it was those countries that were better prepared and should have been higher educated, had better health systems, should have had better health outcomes. So there's no to the extent there's an endogeneity story, it's strengthening this. Anyway, we published this with David and Martin in The Lancet. We got a hell of a lot of response to this. It was debated. Oh yeah, here's Martin. So this was a graph that The Economist produced. I had like an hour conversation with some unnamed journalist at The Economist because everything's unattributed. And he said, the timing's all wrong. Your story can't be right. The mortality decrease started before the privatization, and it slowed down after the privatization. And then Vladimir Popov and some Russian colleagues were calling me up and saying, have you seen what they published in The Economist? And the problem with this data is that this is the real data. And they basically missed this period which we're explaining, which is what occurs during the mass privatization. And correct me if I'm wrong, but they did claim that this was real, that this graph wasn't fraudulent because some of the data points were real, right? That's actually claimed this. And David reversed engineered it and showed that they started the time series, right, every 3 years in.
They took 5-year averages.
5-year averages, and then they started 3 years in with the 5-year averages to get their graph. And anyway, they were already using this graph before the story came out, so they didn't create it just for the story. Anyway, economists who had been advisors on privatization were not super happy with us. So we got a huge amount of, at first I think we were kind of happy to get the debate continued, and then at a certain point, we just stopped responding because these attacks kept coming on, huge debates about the methodology. So I decided, you know what, I don't want to keep having these endless debates about cross-national regression analysis. Let's generate some microdata to try to test this. We're running out of time. I want to leave time for questions. Thanks to the ERC, we managed to get quite a bit of money to generate. So what we did was we took small towns in Russia, what was going to be Ukraine, we couldn't do Ukraine, Hungary, and Belarus, and we measured a lot of features of those towns that should be associated with mortality. And then what we did was we matched those towns, well, what I'll show you in Russia, so just in the European part, from 10 to 100,000. So then we matched those towns. Well, this isn't that important. And the idea was to have these towns so they're essentially identical, except one had fast privatization and one had slow privatization. And then we did an indirect demographic survey in those towns and basically collected information about their relatives. Did they drink? Did they smoke? What was their education? What was their job? Are they alive? What do you think their cause of death was? So then we could estimate in a multi-level way the effects of privatization on mortality. When we look at just the effect, just looking at the towns, at these 535 towns, we see that each 1% of privatization is associated with an increase in mortality, and about a fairly substantial effect. So we see it on that level. What is this a measure? What is this slide? Okay, when we look at mechanisms at the town level, we show that privatization is associated with industrial decline, unemployment, decrease in health resources, alcohol consumption, decrease in fertility. So kind of stress seems to be consistent with the story. And then what we did was when we did the matching towns, these are things that we matched the towns on. And we can see, with the exception of pollution, these are extremely closely matched. And pollution isn't a plausible explanation for what people were dying of. There's no change in cancer. So this is a graph of age-standardized mortality rates. And this is from 25 to 40 and 40 to 65. And what we see is during the period of privatization for the younger people, these are the fast privatized towns. We get from what was a slightly lower mortality, we get a bigger increase in mortality. And interestingly, what we see, they kind of track for the older population, but then in the second, when you get the second crisis, it seems that the shocks were cumulative, and the older population die at a much higher rate. This is not this did not come out well, but what's crucial here, speed of privatization is associated with, when we put it in the multi-level regression, with about 16% in this model higher male mortality rates in these age groups. Italina is here. She's running these regressions. So the effect is what, like 14 to 19%? So we're getting a very big effect, which kind of matches up with the effect that we got on the cross-national regressions. Okay. Anyway, that's the presentation. So the evidence seems to be consistent at the cross-national level, at the settlement level, and at the individual level. So I think it's pretty strong evidence that part of the explanation of the mortality crisis was the extremely rapid privatization. I think logically you could extend and say, well, rapid liberalization and austerity also were the other determinants, as well as kind of loss of national prestige. But those are much harder to get at in any econometric way because there's very little variation. But it's, the funny story about Jeff Sachs. So Martin could tell this one. So we published this in the Lancet. Go ahead, Martin, tell us what happened.
Yeah, well, then went on a process which was recurring every week, which initially Richard Horton thought was good because he liked to have a debate going. And it was, there were all sorts of things from Jeff along the lines of, don't they understand that it's the meat in the Russian diet? Don't they understand all sorts of other things? And one I remember was Mickey is clearly knows nothing of the work of the famous Russian demographer Shkolnikov, to which I replied, I don't know all of Vladimir's work, but I'm fairly familiar with the 29 papers we've co-authored. And then they said, well, they didn't mention alcohol, which we did. And then there was another paper came out at the same time by Richard Pito and David Zorinsky, and they said, and Richard Pito's paper did not mention their paper, which it did, referenced it. So it was really sort of shooting from the hip. And then it sort of finally came to an end whenever he wrote, and these were coming every week for about 40 weeks, every week, every weekend. We were responding in detail to these lengthy, 2,000-word submissions, and this, God, we've shown this before because we've done lots of work before, and most of the points have been addressed in earlier papers. And there was a sort of, well, you didn't say it in this paper. No, we didn't say it in that paper. We said it in this paper. So it went on like that. And finally, he said, my terms of engagement. This was to Richard Horton. My terms of engagement are that I will write a 2,500-word rebuttal to them, and they can have 250 words to reply. To which Richard said, well, sort of, I'm the editor here. I decide. And that it sort of came to an end. But honestly, what was amazing was the amount of effort that he put into it. And then in the final one, and David can comment on this, we looked at the New England Journal's criteria of denialism and or of data torture, and we showed that in fact what was being done, because the critiques of our work were frankly they met all the criteria for torturing the data, which we've got in there. They would put in time lags or take out time lags.
Well, they produced results which showed that there was no effect of war on mortality
No effect of war.
or economic growth.
Yeah, war and economics, there was nothing to explain. It was like the Economist thing.
90% of the mortality was caused by the previous year's mortality in their models.
That's just on the Economist one. In fact, there is a long Russian tradition of this because, of course, Stalin made thousands of lives disappear at the stroke of a pen, and the Economist brought them back to life at the stroke of a pen. So this is not new, but honestly, it was crazy.
Yeah. Anyway, that's the story.
Thank you for
We
that
have
paper,
questions?
and thank you also for that little riff on what I would think of as the politics of science, which I think is extremely pertinent in this area, and we'll hear more of that as we proceed. Right, we have got time for some questions, so thank you very much. Yes?
Hi, I'm sorry if I missed this in all the data, but why do things, when things start to get better, is it just the end of shock, or is there a subsequent phenomena turning up afterwards?
Well, in Russia, I mean, it was the end of the initial shock, and the people most vulnerable died, and then also people figured out kind of survival strategies, but there were then subsequent shocks. Then there was, so it was returning to its natural, well, its level, then there was another shock, and then it starts to return to it, and then there's another shock. Yeah.
It's actually more of a methodological question. How do you actually measure life expectancy at birth? I mean, is this really possible to kind of trace it at an annual level? Or, I mean, because I'm kind of referring to this graph from The Economist, right? They average over periods, so...
Yeah. So it's the probability of expected life. I don't know. David or Martin's here.
Well, it's a synthetic measure. It's a cumulative measure. It's a synthetic measure of the probability of somebody dying in a particular year. So it's not how long any individual will live. At least that period life expectancy isn't. So what it is doing is taking the death rates in each age band in a particular year and bringing them together to get a composite measure. But it is not the length of time that any individual will live. You can do that with cohort life expectancies, which are different.
Yeah. So one of the things about that is infant mortality rates are actually declining, and that has a large effect because of that. So the decrease in life expectancy is kind of underestimating, in some ways, the effect That's why what was a better measure was adult mortality.
Well, it captured much of the same.
Yeah, it's capturing the same thing.
Okay, I'm seeing two hands. There's one here and one down here.
Thank you. It's a very interesting presentation. I'm wondering what Vladimir Putin would make of it.
Well,
You should say that.
funny you should say that. Putin, you know, he should like it if he really thinks about it, because we were critiquing the Yeltsin regime and kind of the chaos of the Yeltsin era. He probably wouldn't really like it because it also implies that maybe Putin's another story. Yeah, well, we're doing this large survey in Putin's Russia, so it's something we had to negotiate. But, you know, that's a complicated story. But can I also just say that this study couldn't have been done without what I'm calling the political economy of public health, right? I had to have studied privatization for 10 years and know all the different methods of privatization and how they were implemented to even come up with the hypothesis to test this. That's what I mean, the multidisciplinarity. And I started working with David at Yale, and, you know, we brought two disciplines together. But like, I don't really think it would be possible for straight public health, other than maybe Martin, to, but I mean, there's a lot of...
He's not straight.
He's not straight. But there's a lot of very detailed, specific stuff about privatization, right? There's a lot of different methods of privatization that were implemented in different ways with different effects in different contexts that I couldn't have understood if I had just been trained in public health. And nor from someone from public health could I have understood the possible mechanisms or what could be explaining this or driving
It's
this.
also the methods that you bring to bear that are key, which is one of the things that's striking me as we go through the day, the novel methods. Carol, can we have a microphone?
Sorry. Thanks. Yeah, really interesting talk. I wonder whether you can say that you've learned, there's anything that's generalizable from these countries, which have a very particular culture and history, to say what's happening in Cuba now, because it seems to me that there's likely to be an unleashing, and it has relatively good health metrics for
Right.
its
So
income.
that's a very interesting question, and a lot of people interpreted our findings as saying, well, privatization kills. And it depends, right? This was a privatization on a scale and of a particular type. You know, had the privatization been done by competitive bidding firms with real owners and experience, we might have had a quite different outcome. I still think you probably get a small effect from stress and labor turnover. I think this is a lesson for how Cuba, when it starts to privatize, is going to privatize. Now, they're not going to try to do mass privatization because there's a lot of Cuban exiles who are going to want to buy stuff up, right? So you're going to have a different story. But so it's a way not to privatize, but amazingly, people still float this idea of mass privatization. It was floated in Egypt. If you're an oligarch, if you're a politically connected insider, and you want to privatize, you have a big state-owned sector, and you can say, well, I'll give the vouchers to the people, right? It'll be politically acceptable, and you know from experience that you and your clients, i.e. the oligarchs, will be able to get this property. So these ideas are repeatedly floated. The architect of these policies, Yadar Gaidar, was brought in by George W. Bush to aid in the restructuring and privatization of the Iraqi economy. And that was, talk about the disconnect. I'm like, yeah, because he did such a great job in Russia. He should, and indeed, he did an equally good job. They did an equally good job in Iraq.
Chilling, could I just end by asking you and possibly our lawyer, you started off by talking about this concept of economic genocide, which has a particular ring. I don't know if that has a legal ring or could have.
Well, my understanding of genocide is it's just a made-up word, which was a compromise, and they didn't want to include, the Soviets wouldn't sign on to the political massacres. They also committed economic genocide in Ukraine. So genocide doesn't, you know, it's a good word, I guess, for, for mobilizing, but it doesn't really mean anything.
It has a specific meaning in international law, but,
Right.
but economic genocide doesn't
No.
have
Larry, thank